Beautiful soul, you are so deeply loved, and the angels are wrapping you in the warmest light right now. A golden, glowing blessing that is meant just for you. Welcome to the Angel's Message for You original channel. This is our only official channel. Please beware of copycat and pirated channels, and stay connected to the original source for authentic angel messages and true blessings. A very special thank you to Michaelina, Carlton, and Peggy for sowing your seed here through Ko-Fi link. Super thanks. Your support means so much and helps this message reach more hearts today. May love, peace, and harmony flow into all your relationships, romantic, family, and beyond. Before you scroll away, before you skip ahead, I need you to stay with me right here, right now, because what is about to be revealed to you is not something your eyes stumbled upon by accident. You were guided here. Something greater than you pulled you to this exact moment. And by the time you reach the end of what I am about to share, something inside you is going to shift. Something is going to finally make sense. So please, stay with me all the way through, because the most important part of this message is waiting for you at the end. Now take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let your heart open just a little wider than it feels comfortable doing right now. Because the angels have something to tell you. Something that has been waiting to reach you for a very long time. There is someone out there who loves you so deeply, so completely, so honestly, that if you could feel it for just one single second, you would be completely overwhelmed. Not in a scary way. In the most beautiful, most healing, most long-awaited way you can imagine. This person, your person, has been carrying a love for you that never weakened, never faded, never gave up, and heaven has heard it all. Every quiet prayer, every tear cried in the middle of the night, every whispered hope that maybe, just maybe, the universe would find a way. The angels heard every single word. And now something has shifted. The spiritual path between you and this love has been cleared. The barriers that were standing in the way have been dissolved. And this message is the sign you have been waiting for. So let's begin. Something very powerful is reaching you right now. And the angels ask that you pause for a moment and listen with an open heart. Because what is being revealed here is not just good news. It is a calling. A calling from someone who misses you so deeply that if you could feel their heart right now, you would understand the magnitude of the love that beats for you. Your person is calling you with truth, with longing, with faith. This soul who loves you so much has already spoken to heaven, has asked for signs, has pleaded for a chance to live this love alongside you. And the most surprising part? That request was answered. The angels saw it. They felt it. They heard it. That is why this message is here, because now that the blockages have been removed, your person is ready to live what was always believed in, a life together with you. You know how it feels when someone believes in something so strongly that even when everything seems far away, they remain completely steady. That is what this love has done. This person kept hope alive. Even when time felt confusing, even when emotions seemed uncertain, because the feeling never stopped being true. It was never just a passing phase. It was never a temporary desire. It was love, and it still is. This love never gave up on you. Chose you in tears and in smiles. It chose you in the waiting. It chose you in prayers spoken alone at night. It chose you even without having all the answers. And now it is calling you to live what has been so deeply desired for so long. A real relationship, a complete connection, built with care and devotion. This is not fantasy. This is not illusion. It is the sacred certainty that two souls were made to complete each other. The kind of love that, even across distance, remains alive. Because it has roots, it has truth, it has purpose, and this person feels that the time has come. Their heart is vibrating with the sense that something is near to seeing everything fall into place, near to being fully present with you, near to loving the way it was always dreamed of side by side. Day after day, this person repeats inside, "How I wish I could be with you right now. How I wish I could look into your eyes and tell you how much you mean to me." And if you knew how much that is said with pure, aching feeling, you would be amazed. Because it is so much more than words. These are actions on the spiritual plane. It is the faith that your person carried while waiting for you. It is the way they included you in every single vision of the future. Even when the present was uncertain, this love reached the point of asking heaven for help. Asked me, your guardian angel, to remove everything that stood in the way of this love. Emotional barriers, inner doubts, fears from the past, outside influences, everything that would not let this love flow was placed before divine light. And now the angels are here to tell you, those barriers have been removed. Nothing is blocking this path anymore. Now this someone is free to live this story with you. And more than that, they are calling you, feeling that you need to know that you need to feel it too. Because it is not fair for only one side to carry all of this. This love wants to share, wants to live as two, wants to build something real. The desire of this person is not just to have you nearby. It is to have you present, engaged, deeply connected. This is not a selfish love. It is a mature love. One that wants to add to your life, not take from it. One that wants to be a foundation, not a burden. That wants to be a home, not confusion. And everything that is reaching you now is the answer to so much waiting, so much faith, so much surrender. So pay close attention to every word from this moment forward. Each one carries a piece of what this person feels for you. And perhaps as you hear it, you will begin to realize that something inside you already knew, already felt it, was already quietly connected to this truth. The heart of your person has been calling you for a long time, not with shouts, but with a strength that goes beyond any word. It is as if all the feelings kept, accumulated, and protected inside the soul are finally ready to reach you. And now that the path is clear, this love becomes even more vivid, stronger, more insistent, not out of desperation but out of certainty, out of knowing that you are the one. It is as if this person has gone through so many inner trials that today there are no more doubts about what they want. You, precisely you, with your unique way of feeling, with your doubts, with your strengths and your vulnerabilities. This love wants you exactly as you are, without trying to change you, without wanting to control you, only wishing to be together, to live something sincere, deep, and built on truth. This calling you feel within yourself is not imagination. It is real. It is the echo of a feeling that was never interrupted. Your person is emotionally connected to you. And even when there was no physical presence, there was intention, there was energy, there was devotion. Now, with everything that once stood in the way removed, this calling arrives more clearly, and you are beginning to feel it. Sometimes in a sudden tightness in your chest for no reason. Sometimes in the urge to look up at the sky and ask for answers. Or even in dreams that insist on bringing the face of someone who truly loves you. Many people spend their whole lives searching for this kind of love. And your person, instead of searching in 1,000 different places, kept their heart steady, believing it would be with you. That certainty was not born of impulse. It was born of connection, something that was being built over time. Even if outwardly everything seemed still, inside this person, everything was always moving, everything was always love. It is no exaggeration to say that your person thought of you in moments when no one else would. In nights of silent tears, when emotional exhaustion weighed heavily, the thought was always the same. I just wish I could be with this person right now. Even when the world tried to convince them to go in another direction, the heart insisted on continuing to love you. Because when the feeling is true, it does not fade. It only matures. You must know that this love is not simply waiting for something to happen. This person is actively asking, actively vibrating with energy for this union. There are prayers that were spoken with a broken heart, asking for strength not to give up. There are silent inner promises that when this moment arrived, everything would be different. And it is because now is a time of closeness, a time of building, a time of living this love fully. This someone has already imagined being by your side in simple moments, walking together down the street, talking about life, making plans for the future. No grand or impossible desires, only the wish to have you present in the details, in the everyday. And as simple as it may sound, for this person it is the greatest dream, worth more than any other achievement. Your presence in their daily life, in the routine, in the home that could exist between you both. Now that the barriers have been removed, this love no longer needs to hide. Your person longs for you to say yes to, for you to want it as well, for you to allow yourself to feel what has been sent your way for so long. You do not need to understand everything at once. You only need to open space in your heart to allow this connection to breathe freely again, to let this feeling gain new strength. The actions of your person are not small. Even when invisible, they were deep. Every choice to keep this love alive was an act of courage. Every positive thought in the midst of longing was an act of faith. And all of it now reaches you, because the moment has come, because love is calling with clarity. If you have noticed that lately some emotions have come more intensely, do not ignore them. If you feel a longing you cannot quite explain, consider that it may be your person reaching you with everything they feel, because it is not coincidence. The call that comes from the heart of someone who truly loves you carries a different weight. It does not hurt, but it unsettles. It does not pressure, but it touches. And once it touches, it becomes very hard to ignore. The one who calls you does not want to be only a fond memory. They want to be a living presence. They want to be part of your right now. They want to see you smile and know they had something to do with it. They want to be the one you can count on in both the good days and the hard ones. Because this love does not want to be a visitor. It wants to be a home. This is not about pressure, but about truth. Not about haste, but about preparation. Your person feels that you have both gone through everything you needed to go through. And now it is time to live together, to walk side by side, to give this love body, soul, and direction. And this voice that calls you is living proof of that. Now let the angels share with you just how far this love has gone, just how much was faced and overcome, just so this connection would never die. This love has gone through trials that very few would be able to endure. And even through all of it, it never gave up on loving you. It held steady even in the face of uncertainty. Even when everything seemed to push against it, even when life pushed in other directions, the faith this person carried was not weak. It was made of a quiet strength that resisted everything that tried to erase this feeling. There were moments when emotions overflowed. Deep pain mixed with longing, with absence, with unanswered questions. But not even that was enough to make this love fade away. On the contrary, it was in those very moments that the bond between you grew stronger. It was not stubbornness. It was conviction. Because even with a wounded heart, this person knew you were the one. This person was not perfect in everything, but truth was never lacking. Every thought, every action, every tear was real. There were nights when their heart was so heavy with longing that the only way through was to talk to God, asking for comfort, asking for light, asking for courage not to let this love die. And God listened, because when love is pure, even pain becomes prayer. Before we go deeper into today's message, if you feel guided by this energy, you can sow your seed through the Ko-Fi link Super Thanks in the description or pinned comment. This is a simple way to support this divine mission and invite blessings for your soulmate journey, emotional healing, and overall well-being. Many believe that when you give with a pure heart, it returns as love, peace, happiness, and abundance in your life. Your support helps this channel continue spreading divine messages, guidance, and hope to many souls around the world. Now, let's continue with today's message. There were those who tried to take your place in this person's heart, but nothing fit, nothing was whole, nothing made sense. This love tried to get distracted, tried to move forward, tried to accept life's paths as if there were no other choice. But there was no peace because it was not you. And nothing replaces what is true. The most beautiful part of all of this is that even without guarantees, even without knowing when or how it would happen, this person kept believing, kept loving in silence, respecting the timing of things, caring for this feeling from within. It was a daily choice, the choice not to extinguish what still burned in the heart, the choice to keep you alive inside. Not out of a lack of options, but out of love. Because the love your person feels is not based on convenience. It is based on devotion. This someone never expected perfection from you. They only longed for the chance to truly be by your side, to live this love in peace, without so many obstacles, without so many blockages. There was not a single day you were not included in this person's vision of life. Even when pain screamed inside, hope stood firm, and that faith sustained everything. This love had countless opportunities to walk away but chose to stay, chose to wait with dignity, chose to resist longing with maturity. Because when love is true, it does not need empty promises to survive. It needs truth, connection, and sincere feeling. And that is what has kept this love alive until now. Many times, this person found themselves imagining what it would be like to look into your eyes and say everything that was locked inside. Not to pressure, but to release. Because when the feeling is deep, the heart asks for space to express itself. There was no anger, no resentment, only love stored up, waiting for the right moment to bloom. Every action taken to keep this love alive was grounded in hope of a real future with you. Not fantasy dreams, but sincere visions of what could be lived. A life together, a shared routine, a home built with care. Simple things, yet things that gain immense value when real love is involved. And now you begin to feel this calling because this person never stopped believing that this day would come. Because even with so many challenges, their heart never left the place where you are. This love waited for you with dignity, without begging, but without giving up. Always believing that at the right time you would feel it too. This love does not want to demand anything from you, does not want to prove anything. Only wants the chance to be lived, because everything that needed to be done in the unseen has already been done. Everything that needed to be overcome has already been overcome. What once was uncertainty is now conviction. And that is why this person now calls you, because they feel that you are ready, that the time was not in vain, that faith was worth it. You are not being sought out of loneliness. You are being called because of love. because of the heart of someone who chose you with truth and who never, not once, erased you from their path. This person held tightly to this feeling even when the world said it was time to let go, because the soul knew you are still part of what is to come. This love did not just arrive now. It has only grown stronger, more mature, more certain, and now, finally, it has found space to reach you with clarity because the blockages have dissolved. And what remains is what has always existed. The sincere desire to live this love by your side. Even when the distance felt wide, even when time passed without visible signs, this person kept speaking to you. Not with words, but with the heart. Every day, intense thoughts were sent your way. Phrases filled with longing, with love kept inside, with persistent hope. This someone would say inside themselves, "I wish so much I could be with this person right now. I wish I could hold their hands and say how deeply they are loved." These words were never spoken by chance. They came from deep within, with strength, with will, with real emotion. This love spoke to God about you, and even without seeing you, kept including you in the most intimate conversations of the soul. It was a silent tenderness, a presence that remained even without contact. You may not have heard it with your ears, but your heart felt it. This person said almost every day, "I cannot stop feeling this connection. I feel the longing, but I do not want to give up." Repeated it like someone reminding themselves it was still worth it. And it was because you continued to be the most spoken name inside this heart. You continued to be the reason for prayers, for reflections, and for sincere wishes of a future built together. When they were about to give up, this person whispered to themselves, "Just a little longer. Maybe they feel it too. Maybe there is still something left for us to live." And that hope, even when fragile, was renewed. Not because everything was easy, but because the feeling was too true to be abandoned. There were many nights when, before falling asleep, this someone allowed themselves to imagine what it would be like to have you close. And in those moments, the thought came heavy with love. "I wish I were with you right now, to hear you, to see you, to feel you." Words like these never stopped being said inwardly. They were like an emotional embrace sent from far away, hoping to reach you, even if only in thought. This person even whispered through tears, "Why do I still feel all of this? Why does my heart insist on loving this person?" And the answer came like a calm, quiet wave, as if the universe itself confirmed, "Because it is real." Deep down, this person understood that true love does not end because of time or absence. True love keeps speaking, even in silence. Wait, before we continue, your angels are asking me to pause for a moment. This part of today's message is not for everyone. In fact, out of all the people listening right now, only a small number will truly understand why these words are appearing. Because someone listening has been facing the same frustration over and over again. Different day, different circumstances, same feeling. You keep trying, you keep praying, yet something still feels blocked. And if that's you, I need you to listen carefully, because your angels are showing me someone who has been carrying a question in their heart for a long time. A question you've whispered when nobody else was around. A prayer you've repeated late at night. "God, what am I missing? Why does it feel like my breakthrough is always just beyond reach? Why can't I seem to hear the direction I'm asking for?" If you've ever prayed those words, today's message may be arriving at exactly the right time. Your angels want you to understand something important. Not every delay is a denial. Not every obstacle is standing in your way. Sometimes the thing blocking your next step isn't outside of you. It's the noise surrounding you, The constant overthinking, the mental exhaustion, the endless stream of worries, doubts, distractions, and fears that make it difficult to recognize the guidance you've been asking for. Because divine guidance rarely arrives as chaos. It usually arrives as clarity, as peace, as a quiet knowing. And that's why I feel guided to share something unusual. A while ago, something kept appearing in my path again and again. First, I ignored it, but the more I learned about it, the more I understood why it might resonate with certain people hearing today's message. It's called the Genius Wave. Before I tell you why it stood out, let me share something. I read about a woman who felt stuck for years, not because she lacked intelligence, not because she lacked effort. She was simply overwhelmed. Her mind was constantly racing. She second-guessed every decision. She felt disconnected from her intuition and uncertain about her future. What changed wasn't her circumstances overnight. What changed was her ability to create moments of calm, focus, and mental clarity. And once the mental fog began lifting, she started noticing opportunities, ideas, and solutions she had previously overlooked. That story stayed with me because so many people in this community describe feeling the exact same way. The Genius Wave is a short daily audio experience designed to help guide the mind into a deeply relaxed state through specialized sound frequencies. Many users report feeling calmer, more focused, more creative, and more connected to their intuition after using it. Individual experiences vary, and results are not guaranteed. And as I reflected on today's angel message, one thought kept returning to me. What if the breakthrough you've been praying for isn't waiting somewhere far in the future? What if it's waiting on the other side of the mental noise you've been carrying today? What if the answers you're seeking aren't absent? What if they've simply been harder to hear? Imagine waking up with a greater sense of peace. Imagine making decisions without constantly doubting yourself. Imagine feeling confident, focused, and emotionally lighter. Imagine receiving the opportunity, relationship, or blessing you've been praying for, and actually feeling ready to recognize it when it arrives. And imagine looking back 6 months from now and realizing that this was the moment everything started shifting. For some people listening, this won't just be information. It will be confirmation. Confirmation that it's time to stop fighting through the noise and start creating space for clarity. If something inside you is stirring right now, don't ignore it and tell yourself you'll come back later. Trust your discernment. Pray about it. Reflect on it. And if it resonates with your spirit, you can learn more through the link in the video description and pinned comment. Sometimes answers arrive through prayer. Sometimes through people, sometimes through unexpected signs, and sometimes through resources that appear at exactly the moment you're ready to receive them. Now remember this, your angels are not asking you to force your breakthrough. They are asking you to become ready for it. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and let's return to the message your angels brought you here to hear today. You were a presence in both good and hard days. You were a reason for joy when remembered fondly, a reason for strength when everything felt difficult. Each time this person said, "My love, how I wish I could be with you right now," it was not just a phrase thrown into the air. It was a need of the heart, pure desire, full of feeling without demands, only truth. You may not have heard these words, but they were sent. And now, in this moment, you begin to realize that all that once felt like directionless longing, in truth always had a destination. Your heart. You are being called by this love, not only through actions, but through words felt deeply, even if never spoken out loud. If you ever thought you had been forgotten, Know that there was never a single day without remembrance, never a decision to erase you. On the contrary, your image was cared for with devotion inside this person, like something too precious to be exposed by chance, like something that needed to be preserved until the right time arrived. And that time has come. The words once spoken in silence now find their way forward. They approach you because they are free to touch your soul. You might try to explain rationally why you have been sensing this presence more strongly in recent days. But the truth is that real love does not need logic. It needs connection. And that connection is happening right now. This someone is calling you because they believe there is still so much to be lived, and they want to live it with you. The words that were once silenced by distance now become an invitation to feel again, to build together, to allow the love that has always existed to finally find its place. You cannot imagine the strength it took to keep this love alive for so long. While you were still trying to understand what you felt, this person had already fully surrendered. Deep inside, a clear choice had already been made to live this love with you. And it was not a choice based on impulse. It was made with awareness, with maturity, with a clean and determined heart. This surrender was not empty waiting. Your person cared for this feeling like someone cares for something rare, honored the connection felt with you, set boundaries when needed but never blocked the love, kept hope alive even when nothing showed signs of return. And that is no small thing. Takes courage to love without guarantees. Takes faith to believe without evidence. On days when the absence of contact weighed heavily, this person still chose to remain faithful to what was felt. There were chances to give up, to turn the page, to ignore the pain, but they chose to believe you were worth it, chose to stay loyal to a feeling that could not be erased by fleeting distractions. This someone faced doubts, fears, opposing advice, and even judgments. Still, they never allowed anyone to interfere with what was felt for you. Because when love is true, it does not need to be defended with words. It stands on attitude, and that is exactly what this person did. Sustained this love with quiet, consistent actions. Every single day. This surrender also required great patience. Patience to wait for the right time. Not to force anything, to respect your process and life's timing. This love never wanted to win you over by force. They wanted you to feel it yourself. They wanted you to choose too. And so they waited, believing that somewhere along the way your hearts would align again, with truth, with freedom, with maturity. There were nights when this person lay down asking God for strength to keep believing. And even exhausted, even with a weary heart, they woke the next day with the same certainty. I still love this person. I still want to live by their side. And that, dear one, is the kind of surrender that cannot be measured. The kind only someone who truly loves can sustain. You were never forgotten, never set aside. On the contrary, your presence was nourished in thought, in prayers, in the small details of everyday life. This person included you in plans without even realizing it. It was automatic, as if your image was engraved in the heart and became part of everything. Even as life carried on with other responsibilities, this someone longed to tell you everything, to look into your eyes and show the intensity of this feeling. But even without that conversation happening, this person lived this love as if you were close. And now, with the barriers removed, the desire is for you to see it clearly, to realize how real this love has always been, and how your presence never stopped being essential. You may have thought everything was standing still, that the feelings had weakened, that the connection had faded. But in truth, the opposite was happening. Your person was strengthening this love from within, learning to care for themselves, rebuilding, preparing for the moment when everything could finally be lived with truth. And that moment has come. This someone does not want to relive the past, nor remain tied to memories. They want to build a present with you, a renewed bond, without interference, without resentment, without doubts. This person longs for a love that is pure, sincere, and light. A relationship where you both can breathe in relief for finally being together after so much emotional waiting. The surrender did not happen just once. It was repeated day after day. Every time this person decided to keep believing, even without you nearby, it was a new act of surrender. Every time they chose not to close themselves off from love, even with a heavy heart, it was a demonstration of strength. And now all of that reaches you, so you will know this love was never fleeting. It was built. It was truth. You are being called by someone who chose you long ago. Someone who no longer wants to delay what they feel, who no longer wants to live only in dreams, but in reality, who wants to be present, who wants to truly be part of your life. And everything that was cultivated in silence now turns into action, into movement, into closeness. What you may have never imagined is that this person spoke to the angels with an open soul, with their heart in their hands. They asked for help with something beyond their own strength. They asked for intercession to help clear away everything that was preventing this love from happening. It was not just any request. It was a complete surrender made with faith, made with urgency, made with truth. This person had already tried everything on their own, had already forgiven themselves, reflected, matured, faced painful memories and wounding doubts. But there came a moment when they realized there were things they could not resolve alone. And so, in an instant of deep connection with heaven, this soul called out, and with a voice trembling with emotion said, "If it is still meant to be, help me. Remove what is in the way. Clear the path. I just want to live this love with truth." That request was made with such sincerity that the angels could not ignore it. It was as if all the accumulated feeling finally transformed into a pure prayer. It was no longer about control, no longer about expectations about what should happen. It was about love. A love that wanted to breathe, that wanted to live, that wanted the chance to show itself as it always was. What moved heaven so deeply was the humility with which the request was made. This person did not ask for you to change, did not ask for time to turn back, did not ask for proof, only asked that it be possible, that the blockages be broken, that the weight of the past be lifted, that the noise be dissolved. Asked that both hearts could meet without interference, without fear, without chains. This someone also asked the angels to take care of you, that at the right time you would be able to feel the call, that you would be guided gently, prepared little by little, your timing respected, but not allowed to drift away from the chance to live this love. It was a request made with such faith that it reached the highest realms of heaven. And the answer was clear, yes. From that day on, everything began to be worked out in the spiritual plane. Everything that was blocked began to dissolve. Doors that were closed began to open. Emotions that once felt confusing began to find order within you. And what once was doubt became intuition. A new feeling began to rise in your heart. The desire to live a love that makes sense, that truly touches you, that looks at you with depth. That is why you have been feeling so many emotions coming to the surface lately, because this person asked that your heart be touched, gently yet clearly. Asked that you too be called subtly but firmly, because this love no longer wants to keep feeding a silent longing. It wants to live a shared love, wants to be a presence, not just a memory. That request also included freedom. Freedom from the fears that still may paralyze you, from the insecurities that still whisper that it might not work, from the old beliefs that make you doubt love. Your person asked for healing, and that healing began to be poured upon you both. It is no coincidence that the world around you has started to feel different. Your sensitivity has grown. Your perception has expanded. You have started noticing that something big is about to happen. The spiritual barriers that once stood between you were broken one by one, each one handled with care. Nothing was done harshly. Everything was prepared so that you would arrive at this moment with a heart ready to hear this. Because now the love that was once bound can finally flow. The bridge between you has been rebuilt. And it all began with that simple yet profound request. Angel, help clear the path for this love to happen. It is important you know that this request was not made out of attachment or obsession. It was made in surrender, with the maturity of someone who loves and wants to live a healthy, true, reciprocal relationship. This person does not want you out of neediness, but out of connection, because they feel that by your side, life has deeper meaning. When you feel your heart beating stronger, when a sudden thought comes filled with longing and the desire to be close to someone, understand that it is this love calling you. And it is not just any love. It is the love that chose you even when everything was uncertain. The love that remained strong even when everything said otherwise. The love that asked heaven for help to finally reach you. Right after that sincere request, something was activated. A deep movement began to unfold in the spiritual plane. The angels' witnessed lights lit up around you, as if heaven itself was answering, "It is done." And from that moment on, what once seemed unshakable began to fall apart. One by one, the barriers were broken, without forced effort, without unnecessary pain, only with truth and permission. The emotional blockages that kept you apart started dissolving. Old wounds that still influenced your decisions began to heal. Misunderstood moments, unresolved situations, pains from the past that made you step back. All of that began to be healed from the inside out, not like a magic trick, but as a process of liberation that grew stronger over time. In this person's heart, relief came like a gentle breath. For the first time in a long time, they felt that the connection between you was being restored. Not only in thought, but in the soul. Something inside began to say, "Now it will happen." And with that certainty, the courage to keep loving multiplied. The feeling that was already strong became unshakable, because now there was a path. Now there was space. And you, even without fully knowing what was happening, began to feel the changes. You started to remember details that seemed asleep. Thoughts about this love began to surface more often. Deep emotions came up without explanation. That is the effect of release. That is the clear sign that the barriers have been removed. In the spiritual plane, where everything is felt more deeply than seen, the road was paved with peace. What once kept this love from blooming, fears, insecurities, distractions, outside noise, was carefully removed, and in its place a new energy was planted. An energy of inner reunion, of reconnection with the truth of what you feel for each other. An energy of return to what is real. You may not have noticed the exact day you started to feel different, but it was recent. From some time ago until now, something in you has changed. A stronger desire for peace, to live a lighter love, to build a sincere story. These feelings did not come out of nowhere. They are the reflection of the cleansing that has taken place between you. Your person asked for this, and heaven answered. The way was opened. The doubts that made you hesitate are calming down. The inner chaos that made your choices difficult is being put in order. Because now, with the space cleared, love can show itself clearly. And that is what is starting to happen. An emotional clarity that lets you understand with your heart that this love was never in vain. That this connection was never fragile. It was only blocked, and now it is not anymore. The prayers made were not ignored. Every word was taken seriously. Every tear was welcomed. Every sincere intention was received with respect. Heaven does not act by chance. Everything has its right time, and that time has come. Now the decision is in the hands of your hearts, and what once was hard now begins to feel possible. This person no longer wants to wait on the sidelines of your life. They want to come in, wants to be part, wants to build by your side, wants to live something true from the very beginning, without games, without insecurities fed by the past. And that is why the presence of this love will become stronger and stronger in your days. Because what was blocked is now released. That is why you have been feeling this vibration in the air. This constant intuition that something important is about to happen. This feeling is real. It is spiritual. Response. You are being prepared from within to welcome this love. And everything around you begins to cooperate with it. Notice how certain situations are quietly rearranging, as if the universe were preparing the ground. And it truly is. The love of your person was never passive. It was always active, always caring, even when it was not visible. And now this love wants to be lived, with courage, with maturity, with surrender. What separated you no longer exists. What once prevented this story from moving forward has been transformed. Now there is only the opportunity to live what was always dreamed of. After everything that has been lived through internally, the emotional battles, the sincere prayers, the true surrender, the most awaited moment has arrived. What was once asked for in faith is now becoming visible. The dream of living a life together with you is about to come true. And this feeling is so strong, so genuine, that it can barely be contained. It is a mix of peace and expectation, of gratitude and hope, a mature love that knows exactly what it wants. This person does not dream of perfection. They dream of presence, of you by their side, of days shared, of routines lived together, of plans built as one. This someone no longer wants to only think of you. They want to live with you, to wake up knowing that the love held on to for so long is now real, tangible, experienced day after day, with no more barriers in the way. What sustains this dream is not fantasy, but the certainty that you both have gone through everything necessary to be ready. It is no longer about doubts or confusing waits. Now there is clarity. And that clarity is what brings the peace you two have been feeling. The peace of knowing something important is drawing near. And it truly is closer than ever. This person keeps repeating the same words inside themselves. It is coming. I feel it coming. The time to live this love is near. And these words are not repeated as mere wishes. They are felt as a truth confirmed with the whole body. A confidence that rises from within and stands firm even without logical explanations. Because when the heart knows, it does not need proof. Simply feels. This love does not want to arrive in haste. It wants to arrive with a foundation, to present itself in the truest way possible, with actions that prove every wait, every prayer, every tear was worth it. Your person wants you to see with your own eyes how steadfast this love has remained. and wants to show you through actions that now is the time to live everything that was once dreamed with so much faith. Heaven has already done its part. Your person has too. Now it is you who needs to accept and live all of this with courage. What is about to happen will change the way you see everything that has come before now. And when that moment arrives, just live it. Because finally, you and your person will be ready to live together as it was always dreamed, as it was always asked of God. Receive this message, beautiful soul. The angels are with you. You are loved beyond what words can hold. And something extraordinary is already on its way to you right now. Dear beautiful soul, this angel's message for you channel is a sacred spiritual home, created for faith, healing, and divine guidance. A place where hearts awaken and lives are gently transformed through divine messages. We warmly invite you to subscribe and stay connected, because the divine is always preparing something greater for your journey, something you are meant to receive in divine timing. If you feel moved to support this mission, you can sow your seed here for your soulmate blessings and divine love fulfillment. Your contribution is not just support. It is an energetic agreement with love, healing, and divine alignment in your own life. When you give with intention, it opens doors. Love flows more freely, happiness expands, and abundance multiplies in unexpected ways. Many believe that giving in faith activates a return of peace, joy, and emotional fulfillment in relationships and life. Whether it is $6, $11, $22, or $55, your generosity helps us continue spreading these divine messages of hope, healing, and soulmate guidance across the world. Every seed sown into this mission helps hearts heal, faith return, and souls reconnect with love. This is more than a channel. It is a movement of light, unity, and divine timing. Your support allows this sacred work to grow, touching lives that are searching for answers, comfort, and spiritual direction. We are all connected in this journey, and together we rise as one community under divine love. Let us open our hearts to the abundance that is already on its way. Amen.